Okay, thanks everybody. Sorry, we're on a tight time schedule. I'm being told to keep to time, so I've got to do as I'm told. So I just wanted to welcome you to the workshop this afternoon. I wanted to acknowledge traditional owners, Word Tree people, pay my respects to the elders past and present, and for their continuing connection to culture. So this workshop is meeting ambitious restoration goals in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration at the national, state and local scale, and it's supported by Greening Australia. And I just wanted to acknowledge Sam Craigie from Greening Australia, who put in a lot of work to get this workshop program together, but unfortunately can't be here because of good old COVID. During the session we will take a short break to provide you with a Mentimeter poll. You've used it this morning, so hopefully you'll be used to it by now. The instructions will be up on the screen, and the answers to the survey will show as we go through it. So first off, we've got two online presentations. Dr. Emma Ladouceur from German Centre for Integrative Biodiversity Research, who will present on the Global Restore Project, Knowledge Sharing for Shared Success. And then next up, we've got Dr. Blair Parsons from Greening Australia, and Blair is Greening Australia's representative on the Restoration Decade Alliance, and we'll be presenting on viewing ecological restoration through an impact lens to generate benefit in landscapes. So hopefully these pre-recorded videos will be starting to play very shortly. Don't want to be talking and have the online people miss out. Here we go.
Hey everyone. I'm excited to tell you today about our collaborative synthesis initiative with an open science vision, the Global Restore Project. As a brief introduction, my name is Emma Ladouceur. I'm a postdoc with the Biodiversity Synthesis and Physiological Diversity groups based at the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, or IDIB for short, in Leipzig, Germany. I have a history of working on conservation and restoration within Australia, and so I'm pretty excited to be able to be a part of this conference, even if it's just remotely. I studied conservation biology at University of Queensland and practiced restoration across a variety of contexts. I'm working as a co-leader and partner on this work with Nancy Shackelford at the University of Victoria. And I'd like to invite each of you to reach out to either of us. We're working with an awesome team that I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about. Nancy also has a history working in Australia with the folks over in Western Australia on restoration projects in drier areas and arid lands. So today I'll be talking about restoration as a way to mitigate anthropogenic impacts as complementary conservation action, as opposed to just protecting land from being disrupted. We can, the idea is that we can restore land after it's already been disturbed. Restoration can take place naturally via natural regeneration, which I'll be referring to as passive restoration, or active treatments can be applied, such as seeding or planting of desirable species in combination with management actions such as fire or rotational grazing or intermediate disturbances like that. Now it's the decade on ecosystem restoration, and the United Nations via this decade is aiming to provide the means and the incentives for upscaling restoration efforts worldwide. Although the main foci is socioeconomic engagement, we all know successful restoration requires sound ecological knowledge to successfully restore biodiversity and ecosystem services, as this is not an easy thing to do. And this decade is similar to other large-scale global challenges, such as the Bond Challenge, which operate on a pledge-based system where nations pledge certain amounts of land they'll restore. The overall target is 350 million hectares of land globally. They're estimating this could cost anywhere upwards of $800 billion US to implement, but with lots of projected results, such as gigatons of greenhouse gas removed, ecosystem services, and of course benefits for people. This 350 million hectares depends on more locally based actions. And restoration is a locally based action which requires intricate habitat-based knowledge. This includes qualitative detail and expert nuance that often isn't easily quantified. Restoration outcomes of these locally practiced actions are pretty unpredictable, and scaling up these knowledge and these actions to achieve these really big goals carries risk that the goals might not be met. For example, restoration can take place along a continuum of anthropogenic contexts. The Society for Ecological Restoration defines this as the restorative continuum. There's a bunch of actions we can take across this continuum that aren't just necessarily aiming for, perfect, pristine nature. It ranges from reducing human impacts in urban areas to renaturalizing landscapes and agroecological systems to restoring graded sites, aiming for a natural reference habitat. Finding ways to better integrate knowledge of socio-ecological and economic contexts with restoration practice remains an interdisciplinary challenge, and we really need a lot of folks to put their heads together to think more on this. So I've worked across a range of these contexts, and I've been inspired to think of ways we could predict restoration outcomes better and quantify and understand success. And so I've been looking for ways that we can restore more efficiently and effectively. Of course, I'm not the only one increasingly thinking this way. In a Web of Science search, looking for published articles in restoration, you can see that the study of restoration is relatively new and has been increasing. There's also likely a huge amount of existing studies and experiments where the data could be pulled out and used for synthesis across contexts. This could help to improve our understanding of restoration outcomes, as well as improve predictive capacity of restoration before we start. But to share and combine these data is a big data integration effort. Once this effort is made, though, we have the power to synthesize restoration efforts across these contexts and share this information with other people to hopefully guide and inform policy and improve evidence-based actions. And so I'm here to talk today about our effort to do exactly that. In the Global Restore project, we're compiling a database of community vegetation monitoring data and restoration projects all over the world. And we're aiming to make this completely open access once we've compiled it and worked out all the details. We've currently got about 160 data sets processed, which represent over 1,500 unique sites globally from over 130 contributors across 25 countries, almost 7,000 standardized species names that occur within restoration globally, and 1.6 million plant records. At the core of this effort, we're trying to harmonize and standardize this data so that it can speak to each other so that we can learn better from it. But we're also trying to keep it in its rawest form possible so that it can be flexibly used for a variety of contexts. In this compilation, we're aiming to take an approach that has a rich comparative framework built into it. We're collecting this monitoring data across 4 main types of sites. Never disturbed sites are places like LTER or vegetation remnants. Actively restored sites where active seeding or planting treatments have taken place. Passively restored sites where disturbance has ended, or finally in places where disturbance is continuing. When considered together, these represent the anthropogenic disturbance gradient that we can use to compare restoration treatments to reference habitats and other contexts. And we can better understand the effect restoration treatments have and hopefully how to better restore communities. Regarding the active restoration treatments, we're very carefully collecting a lot of metadata associated with these treatments, such as the species composition of treatments or the species richness of treatments and the rate at which treatments are applied. If some of this information isn't available, it's okay, but wherever it is available, we're collecting it very carefully and keeping track of it so that we can use this to understand our outcomes. For example, in a regional system of grasslands of old fields and never plowed remnant vegetation in the US, we find that at local plot scales and at field scales shown here, species richness is not fully recovering over time, even after 80 years since agricultural abandonment via natural regeneration. This tells us that maybe restoration interventions are needed to achieve full recovery within this system. But we do find at other scales, here looking at field-to-field variation or the heterogeneity across the landscape, we find that this system is recovering a bit more in terms of this metric, in terms of this scale. This is knowledge that could help us better apply our restoration treatments, such as seeding in patches or seeding at different times to achieve direct dispersal and some natural facilitation on its own. And we're using that to then inform some restoration practices and try to achieve better outcomes. In this project, Nancy and I got together to pool our data early on. Nancy's been working in arid zones, and she calls her effort the Global Arid Zone Project, and I've been working in non-arid zones. We brought our data together, and we're also linking it with other existing data sources, such as land cover, climate data, which might be temporally explicit or not, and also plant trait data. This means that that we can use all of these variables to better understand our outcomes as well. We're excited to be releasing the first part of this database to be open access soon, and we're excited to be connecting with folks from every corner of the world who have data to share. We're still building in an iterative process. And so this map represents the coverage we currently have across over 1,000 sites globally. And our first analysis will focus on the region of North America and leverage that information. And then we'll focus on each region in stages, connecting with folks that are doing restoration there and putting together a rich comparative data set for each region. Once we understand restoration in space and time better, we can begin to tailor the application of species mixes, not only in terms of species richness, but also in terms of providing building blocks to support desirable ecosystem functions and support conservation of other species as well. Here, if I had a small budget and I need to ask what the minimum number of plant species for my restoration species mix was to best enable and support the provision of all these plant attributes, I could prioritize species C and E in my species mix, and I could spend my budget for restoration efficiently while still potentially delivering my targets. And I could provide habitat for birds or resources for pollinators. This is just a simplified sketch, but whenever you're considering an entire species pool for habitat, this question becomes quite complicated. And so we used a quantitative approach to help us figure this out and identify species lists that would lead to favorable outcomes. Surprisingly, we found that just selecting species for taxonomic diversity of plant species didn't always provide resources for specialist species and specialist relationships such as native bees, butterflies, or birds. Further to this, we're interested to explore processes of disturbance, regeneration, and restoration across other systems as well. And here's a few of my favorites I hope we'll be able to target in the future. With that, I'd like to wrap it up and invite you to check out our efforts and reach out if you're interested in getting involved. If you are interested in getting involved or just hearing more, you can get in touch with me, Emma, or Nancy Shackelford at University of Victoria, or one of our key Australian partners, Todd Erickson at the University of Western Australia. I'd like to thank my mentors, advisors, and collaborators in this project. And I'd like to thank you for being here. I hope you have a great conference. I'm disappointed I can't be there, but I'd love to chat if any of you have any questions or comments about this presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Blair Parsons and I lead the Science and Design team here at Greening Australia. I'm presenting on behalf of many people within the organisation working to progress restoration at scale across the country. Today I'd like to focus on some new ways of thinking that are assisting Greening Australia in meeting the challenge but I'm deliberately not focusing on the scientific detail of restoration. Rather, I'd like to cover how the various activities that Greening Australia are undertaking align with our pursuit of positive environmental impact. So very briefly, there is significant and compelling evidence of why we need to restore ecosystems. We're seeing unprecedented environmental disturbance, and at the moment that's presenting itself in recent extreme events across the country and beyond, in the form of fire and also in floods. We're also seeing continued and chronic degradation in disturbed landscapes. So a clear example of this where I'm from is dryland salinity in the Western Australian wheat belt. We're also seeing widespread and increasingly conspicuous collapse of key ecosystems across the country. One example of that is the collapse of Eucalyptus viminalis woodlands throughout large areas of Eastern Australia. And we're also seeing continued and intensifying climate change. So our collective and urgent response to that is in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Despite the overwhelming evidence, our action is insufficient. In 2018, David Freudenberger aptly described the collective response as a mere cautious fiddling. Clearly, a new approach is needed to achieve impact, and this is increasingly being acknowledged. For example, in 2018, Greening Australia undertook some strategic work, including some spatial modelling, and that showed that roughly 8 million hectares of revegetation was required to achieve 30% veg coverage in Australia's fragmented agricultural landscapes. And there is a collective national target there of about 1 million hectares by 2030 that would need to be achieved. Similarly, in a scenario of environmental resilience posed by CSIRO as part of its National Outlook Vision, it suggested between about 11 and 20 million hectares of revegetation is necessary. Recently, Mappen and others identified a target of around 13 million hectares, and importantly, they determined that the restoration of this extent was both attainable and affordable, with one example of that being that carbon revenue could more than pay for the costs of the ecological restoration itself. So to work through the logic of the ecological restoration process and to better understand risks and assumptions, it's useful to frame our thinking in terms of impact. That is, working from the initial problem and then through the hierarchy of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and finally then impact. Greening Australia has been doing just that in order to help direct its effort and investment and ensuring we meet our 2030 goals. This slide depicts a simplified version of the impact framework and is articulating the major steps required to achieve that impact. So we start in the top left corner with problem definition, which is represented primarily by the twin crises of biodiversity and climate change and their direct impact on society. We then move on through the stage of understanding our problems, finding and assessing solutions, and securing key inputs for restoration, and those are namely land, seed and capital. If we can effectively secure those elements, we then progress through implementation and onto ecological outputs and outcomes. Finally, if our restoration produces the outcomes we're after, typically expressed as a variety of ecosystem services, then we will achieve benefits for people and nature. Our impact goals would be defined to reflect these benefits, and ultimately that would lead to the achievement of our overall vision. For Greening Australia, that is, healthy and productive landscapes where people and nature thrive. So immediately upon framing our thinking this way, it is evident that two core inputs currently and will always require focus to achieve restoration at scale, and you can see them in red. That is, supply or access to seed and access to land. So Greening Australia is busy in this space, working on the establishment of seed production areas nationally and understanding seed supply and exploring different options and models for engaging with landholders to collaborate on restoration. The impact framework also makes it explicitly clear that we need to know where we should work to maximise our impact. To address the question of where, we need to undertake spatial prioritisation at multiple scales. At a national scale, prioritisation is largely based on delineating areas based on where we can have restoration impact and where our efforts will actually be feasible. At a regional scale, we can start to frame up the extent of land available or appropriate for restoration, and that can be based on factors like tenure, which ecosystems are actually feasible to restore, and the vegetation extent that currently exists in that landscape. We can also refine our priorities based on more specific biodiversity, land, and feasibility drivers. So these can include the presence of threatened species and communities, severity of degradation, and restoration risk and associated costs. At a local scale, restoration demands that we plan carefully via detailed designs, and they need to be aligned with SARA standards and potentially guided by regulatory compliance, and that might include biodiversity or carbon offsets. If we refer back to the impact framework, if we have secured the necessary inputs and we have a clear idea of where we are working, the next step is to successfully establish restoration. However, it's clear that restoration is not straightforward, and if we can't successfully establish ecosystems, then all of our inputs and outcomes are at risk. So ensuring successful implementation and establishment is a key consideration warranting investment, particularly in terms of applied research and innovation. So GA's approach to improving the quality and reliability of its restoration approach is multifaceted and reliant on collaboration with many partners. In the restoration planning space, it is key to align with the SARA standards to provide a transparent and defensible approach, and one that is based on threatened species and ecological requirements. In terms of establishment, restoration often occurs in difficult land systems, for example, sandy land systems, and so there is a direct need to ensure that the plantings survive. Current ways that we might be able to enhance survival is through the testing of soil stabilisers, soil additives to improve moisture holding ability, inoculation with mycorrhizae, and by using specific water harvesting techniques prior to planting. These are all being undertaken within experimental frameworks. To achieve restoration at scale, it needs to be as cost effective as possible as well, without sacrificing ecological outcomes. So techniques and solutions for direct seeding show promise in this space, and we are actively developing these. The Australian restoration sector has also invested in applied research relating to bushfire recovery and how to adapt to extreme fire events. Project Phoenix, Green Fire Breaks, and the Seed Adaptation Projects are three examples of this as they seek to build up seed supply within the sector, reduce risk, and increase resilience in our post-fire restoration. Similar investment has also been made with respect to climate change and facilitating ecosystem adaptation. The final point I'd like to draw your attention to in this framework is in the impact space. For restoration to achieve scale and impact, it must be clearly and appropriately valued. As you can see in the red spots there, without appropriate valuation of restoration, the sector cannot demonstrate its worth to beneficiaries, and it can't link to markets, and therefore uptake of restoration is unlikely. So a useful example of how we need to broaden our definition of value can be made using Greening Australia's shade shelter fodder system, which is an integrated solution that provides multiple benefits for on-farm productivity, biodiversity, and potentially carbon sequestration. It's a biodiverse mixed species planting designed to include fodder resources which can fill autumn and drought feed gaps for stock and address land degradation. We can use the SARA evaluation wheels to describe how we might monitor and evaluate shade shelter fodder to demonstrate its value. On the left, we can see the ecological wheel, describing the traditional domain of monitoring and where ecologists feel most comfortable. These elements are routinely monitored to determine revegetation establishment and success, perhaps with the exception of external exchanges, which receives a bit less focus. However, if we focus on the social wheel on the right, which is typically not considered explicitly in restoration, we can explore its relevance. So is the system generating farm productivity and profit? Is it reversing farmland degradation? Is it successfully sequestering carbon and generating credits? And is this leading to an appropriate cost share and equitable benefit to the landholder? And finally, are we continuing to learn and improve from the work undertaken? These are all key social aspects that need to be measured. So to value the ecological contribution of the restoration consistently, we're exploring the use of different methodologies. And accounting for nature is one example that is underway and accepted in this space, and that we are actively having a look at. Valuation of social aspects is less mature, and Greening Australia is currently assembling its theories of change around this to articulate our thinking and to allow for identification of relevant indicators that we might use to monitor and evaluate. So just to summarise then, if I may, an impact-centric approach is useful to test our logic and assumptions about what is needed to achieve our restoration goals. To achieve impact in the UN decade, our focus areas will extend beyond the ecological science of restoration. Significant effort is required in the enablement of restoration supply in the space of seed, land and efficiency, and also in defining and valuing outcomes for nature and for people. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emma and Blair. That was great to have those two presentations online. I'll ask Martin to come up while we move on to some Mentimeter. And for those that don't know me, we rushed through to get started earlier. I'm Damian Wrigley. I'm National Coordinator for the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. I'm not just some middle-aged white man who thought I could get up here and start yelling at you all. So you've all had a bit of a practice with Mentimeter. So what we're going to do now is Amelia's going to start getting some questions up for us. So these ones, you can go through the Mentimeter app again, you can go online, or you can use the code or the QR code. Once you've logged in, we'll wait for a few more of those little love hearts, the likes, to come up, so we know that everybody's online. Looking good. A few more, hopefully. Okay, so our first one here, what's your role in the environmental sector? I think that might have dropped out again, Amelia. There we go. Take a moment to read through them. Community groups, restoration practitioner, traditional owner, consultant, researchers getting a few, education and training. Good to see our landholders come up. A lot of researchers in the room. Oh, here we go. Give you a couple more seconds to get your answers in. A lot of others there. Okay, 2 more seconds. Pressure's on. Okay, that's great. So the second one, we'd like to know how you've been involved in action on ecological restoration. So you can choose more than one option here. So hopefully that's showing up on your screen as well. So there's local projects, there's research, coordination, responding to the Native Seeds Survey, being involved in the Healthy Seeds Project, participated in the Native Seed Strategy under Project Phoenix, development of the Sarah, Flora Bank or germplasm or translocation guidelines. You can be interested but not yet involved, so we welcome you to participate in what comes next. And you'd like to know more. So give you a few more seconds to go through those, put your answers in. Feel free to be greedy. So this is really important for us. As a sector, we've been unified by common projects, particularly recently, and lots of action on ecological restoration following the bushfires. And you know, we're all very heartened to see the work that's been done, particularly what's been presented already. So thanks everyone for all of the hard work over the last couple of years. I know a lot of us are feeling very exhausted, but it's all been definitely worth it. Okay, so we'll move on to the next speaker. I think we've finished up over there now, so it's good to see that local projects is one of the highest ones on there, and research. Our next speaker is Martin Driver. Martin's been with the APCC as a project manager since 2014, and he's spent the past 2 years coordinating the Healthy Seeds project to produce the draft Healthy Seeds Roadmap, a strategic plan to improve native seed supply for ecological restoration in New South Wales, as well as the new Flora Bank guidelines. Martin's also a co-author of the Australian Native Seed Survey report released in 2020. And Martin will be presenting on behalf of Sam Craigie from Greening Australia, who I mentioned can't be with us, and will cover the National Native Seed Strategy and the New South Wales Healthy Seeds Roadmap. And this is a time for action. Thanks, Martin.
Now, which is our key? Right. Righto, as Damian said, that Samantha Craigie was supposed to be, we're supposed to be co-presenting this together, and she must be, well, I'm sure she is devastated that she can't be here after 2 years of very intensive work that she's put in on the Project Phoenix. I've only just got this presentation this morning, so bear with me and we'll see how we go. So this was always meant to be a collaboration on Project Phoenix and Healthy Seeds, because both projects sort of evolved out of the original seed survey that came from the 2016 APCC conference and led to a whole lot of findings and publications, which Paul Gibson Roy will be speaking about shortly. Okay, so the things we're going to try and cover in this presentation is just the project inceptions, what Project Phoenix and Healthy Seeds is about, the collaboration outcomes that have come from both of those projects, and how we can maximise progress from here and what does come next. Okay, well, the survey showed, and a lot of work that had come from that and conversations that have been in the industry have really highlighted that there is a need for change and a need for action to address the structural issues associated with the sustainability of the native seed industry. Project Phoenix and Healthy Seeds have been involved from the start. Once the project, the Healthy Seeds, the survey was completed, we both were simultaneously working on resourcing to try and look at how some of the issues that have been identified in the survey could be addressed. In New South Wales, we received funding from the Environmental Trust in New South Wales, and simultaneously Greening Australia was working and got Commonwealth funding for that work. So the outcomes and collaborations. The Project Phoenix priority areas were in looking at the areas of native and developing a native seed strategy, looking at ways to address capacity building across the seed sector, analysing and looking at the data that's already been come up, shown about the fire impacts across the country, and focusing on threatened flora and fauna, flora species, and working together on the Flora Bank, which was funded, the review and updates of the Flora Bank, which was funded under the Healthy Seeds program, was jointly worked on, and also the training and community development work that arose from the Flora Bank project updates. Healthy Seeds project, some of the outcomes were the initial Seeds for the Future Forum, which was working from the seed survey and getting feedback from people on what were the issues that they saw and whether the stuff that's been identified in the surveys was relevant to them. It also involved an audit of all seed production areas in New South Wales that could be identified, and what the barriers and opportunities for seed supply in New South Wales were. The update, and in that consultation there was a huge amount of feedback of people's concerns, not just the barriers and opportunities. It was also a lot of the personal stuff about difficulties that various people in the seed sector were having, and the general feeling of those despondent was the main thing at that time. That we also obviously were involved with the oversight and the update of the Flora Bank guidelines, and Lucy Commander will be talking about that later as well, and the draft Healthy Seeds Roadmap, which will have a summary up on a poster very shortly. It's not up yet, but it is available, and it is available online. So the collaboration efforts, basically Project Phoenix was operating at the national level, and Healthy Seeds was operating at the New South Wales level. And as I said, that the projects were contemporarily funded, and we were working together the whole time on both projects and communicating very regularly, and also voicing our frustrations and concerns with things that were arising. Okay, well, what comes next? We're looking, both projects are looking at practical implementation, and what are the things that would spell success for the seed industry. And that was successful enterprises that are out there, new environmental programs and initiatives that were ongoing, and one of the key issues that was identified is the fact that these short-term projects that are stop-start don't enable sustainability in the sector. Obviously, sustainable land management and self-sustaining ecological systems, and a viable commercial sector within the environment of the volunteer sector and land care movement and landholders' contributions, etc. Okay, on what can you do? One, I think, is reading. I think Paul Gibson Roy would be delighted for people to read the survey and understand what's in it. Also, in each of the programs, to just get an overview from Healthy Seeds, from the summaries and Project Phoenix, and understanding that, and become an advocate to people who have influence in the sector or across the sector. Your local members, your local CMAs, LLSs, your regional environmental bodies, and indicating those things that are seen as being important. Part of the problem is that the sector is so fragmented and people working in isolation. We do need some advocates and champions for the sector. As I said, download and read both the strategies and the Healthy Seeds Roadmap. Sign up to Flora Bank would be a good form. Consider the Australian Seed Federation and the needs of a body representing the seed sector, and contacting the Commonwealth and ideas on how to move the national strategy forward. The outlines of both the Project Phoenix and the address for contact for that and the Healthy Seeds are listed there. But one of the key things I'd like to stress as well, and it was been mentioned in a couple of presentations, these things happen locally. Project restorations happen locally. They happen in regions, and they happen because of, if we're really serious about wanting self-sustaining ecosystems, we need people with sustainable work to do the jobs, sustainable programs and funding. So again, it seems bleedingly obvious. We need seed if we're going to have restoration. Seed is integral to most restorations. We need action and practical action in the regions, and we need people being supported to produce those self-sustaining ecological systems. My biggest concern is in 2002, Michael Williams produced a paper which outlined many of the things that have been reiterated in both Project Phoenix and the Healthy Seeds program, and my concern is that nothing came from that. 20 years down the track, we're almost in the same position. And we really, as a sector now, need to build the capacity and have seed there in a long-term, ongoing way to do the work that we all say that we want to see happen. And on behalf of Samantha and myself, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin and Sam, for putting that talk together. And you couldn't tell that you only got it today, Martin. That was great. Thank you. And a big shout out to Sam. It's one of those projects, Project Phoenix. It was a phenomenal undertaking, being given a project of that value, having to develop and deliver it after such a major event, but also during COVID. A huge undertaking, and likewise with Healthy Seeds. Well done. So next up, we've got two more online presentations. They'll run back to back, so I'll introduce them both together. To start with, we've got Dr. Paul Gibson Roy, who's a restoration ecologist specialising in grassy community restoration. He's also been involved in recent assessments of the native seed industry through the APCC's Australian Seed Sector Survey and Report. And Paul will be talking to us about characteristics of the Australian seed sector that present challenges to meeting UN Decade Restoration goals. Following Paul will be David Carr, who has 35 years' experience working in the natural resource management area as a botanist, an ecologist and a restoration practitioner. David specialises in communicating environmental science to land managers through direct engagement, in projects, extension and through training. He established Stringy Bark Ecological in 2010 and is the principal ecologist and director of Stringy Bark. And again, we thank Stringy Bark Ecological for sponsoring lunch today. David will be presenting on constraints in industry capacity and meeting the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration goals. Thanks, Paul and David.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Gibson Roy. It's a pleasure to be able to speak at this AMPC conference on the topic of the Australian seed sector. The Australian seed sector is composed of a disparate group of people from a wide range of players, commercial, non-government, universities, land care groups, farmers. It's developed in an ad hoc fashion over several decades, and really it does not always work together in a cohesive and effective manner for that reason. We found that in terms of a sector, the largest group within it identify themselves as seed collectors, so around 48% of the sector, and that they pass this seed on to a number of other groups, whether they're seed purchasers, seed growers, or other seed users, to make use of that seed. In terms of how people are affiliated, we found that nearly 50%, so 28% are associated with commercial organisations and government agencies, with the remainder associated with NGOs, community groups and other groups. So really this breakdown is a slight transition from earlier surveys as those done by Mortlock and Florabank in the late 90s, showing that we have a higher representation of commercial operators in the sector now than was the case then, where it was much more focused on community groups and land care groups. From earlier surveys as those done by Mortlock and Florabank in the late 90s, showing that we have a higher representation of commercial operators in the sector now than was the case then, where it was much more focused on community groups and land care groups.
promise you we do have fairies in the background trying to fix this.
Agencies running programs around seed collection, plant ID and things like that. When we asked people to nominate whether they had undertaken training, almost 50% of seed collectors and 72% of seed growers said they'd not undertaken any training, and nearly 80% of seed purchasers said that they didn't require training. The survey also queried whether people are associated as members with organisations like APCC, Arbor, Sarah and the like. And we found that 77% of respondents had not joined any. So whether this is engagement or financial barriers to people joining, whether or not it's difficult to determine, but these low levels of membership suggest that the sector has poorly developed networks, which might otherwise be really important in raising the profile of the sector or creating the sort of cohesion that we need. We asked people to rank a whole range of issues of concern. All the issues that we raised were ranked highly, above the midpoint. So there weren't any issues that people saw as not a concern, but you can look through that list and many of them will be familiar to you. So future demand for seed is going to be difficult to meet from wild harvest. The market is unwilling to pay for the true cost of collecting or growing seed. There's a lack of seed from a broad range of species. Demand is unpredictable and inconsistent. All these things will be familiar to most people in this room. We also found that while a largish proportion of people said that they do hold current seed licensing permits, a relatively large proportion do not. And the sort of issues that people raised around seed licensing were that they were complicated. They were often arbitrary procedures and difficult to interpret the decisions made by agencies. The turnaround times to getting a permit were very long. And what this meant when you put it all together is that many collectors just choose not to work with licenses. And there are obviously issues around that because we really want an effective seed permitting system. So there is really clearly a need for meaningful discussions between the various licensing agencies in the different groups and regions and the different people who are involved in collecting or using seed to come up with a more workable, effective and equitable system. We asked all our participants where they collected or purchased seed from. And what we found was that the bulk of seed in Australia at the moment is collected on private land, public reserves or roadsides. Now this is an issue because most of those represent small and fragmented population with a high probability of genetic implications around things like inbreeding depression. And that seed is then being used in our restorations as seed or plants. And this means that our restoration themselves may be compromised. Local provenance since the late 90s has been talked about in Australia as the preferred model. But what we found when we asked people where they're collecting seed from is that that attitude is shifted. And people now are routinely collecting from much wider provenance ranges. And now whether that's been around revised guidance around climate change adaptation or whether the provenance stipulations are being ignored or flouted simply for meeting pragmatic goals around access to seed, price or business viabilities, it's difficult to determine. But you can see here from these figures that when you look at the categories where we ask people to nominate where they collected or purchased seed from, that they are skewed much to the right in the wider distance categories from 50 to 500 and beyond kilometres, and very little was undertaken at the 10 to 20. That's for trees. Exactly the same curve for shrubs, grasses and wildflowers. So local provenance clearly in Australia now is not the norm. Seed availability, same sort of issues. We found that overwhelmingly across all our groups that annually seed is either being collected or purchased in small amounts. And this really means that we aren't using a lot of seed in restoration. So again, you can see the categories we ask people to nominate, and these curves are skewed to the left towards the lower collection weights or use weights. So while there are still some people who use seed in large quantities, the bulk are doing it in the low category ends, so to the left. So trees, shrubs, grasses and wildflowers. So that's a really telling finding. In terms of diversity, we want diversity in our restorations. Are we getting it? We asked all our respondents, what is typical amount of diversity either tended for in your collections or used in your programs? And what we found that was the bulk of respondents, 60%, and half of seed purchasers nominated the less than 20 species category as that typically requested for projects. And only 3% of respondents nominated that they typically requested or used greater than 100 species. So what this tells us is Australian restorations are unlikely to be species rich, and they would fall well short of any goals to mitigate the diversity currently being lost. Seed production areas could offer a solution to seed limitation, but what we found was that like the broader sector, seed production enterprises, which are mostly commercial, are small in size. They typically grow a very limited range of species, less than 10, 15 and 20, and as you saw on the previous slides, they produce relatively small amounts of seed. So while seed production offers a lot of potential, at the moment they are not delivering on that, again because we don't have a large market to support them. Seed testing is another issue. We found that overwhelmingly native seed is not being routinely tested in Australia. 80% of seed collectors, 72% of seed growers indicate that it was uncommon to be asked for seed testing information from a purchaser, and likewise 75% of seed purchasers said it was unlikely to be offered that information. So seed is routinely being used in Australia in restoration without knowledge of its viability, with all the consequences that you can come up with yourself from that scenario. So in summary, this national survey provided a really clear snapshot of our sector, and it sheds light on a sector with a workforce size that's small, business size, limited capacity, lacking in training, with a whole range of constraints around seed availability to diversity, worries about being paid for the full cost of producing seed. And all these things could limit its capacity to provide this key resource for landscape scale restoration. So Australian seed markets clearly do not yet support large-scale enterprises or the infrastructure and capacity required to undertake landscape-scale restoration. So this presents a clear concern to all users of native seed in terms of current capacity for ecological restoration to meet all our internal requirements. But what it also signals very clearly is that we will not be able to make a meaningful contribution to our global commitments under the UN Decade for Restoration goals unless there are radical changes to the way the sector operates and our markets and our policies and our programs are configured. If you would like to read a much more detailed explanation and expose of these survey findings, please see these two papers, which are full open access papers in Restoration Ecology. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and greetings from Armidale. I'm going to be talking about some of the constraints I see in us meeting the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration goals. 2021 to 2031 is the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. It is designed to give impetus to the ecosystem restoration movement across the planet and recognises the impact that the rapid decline of the natural world is having. The full story can be found on the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration website. It includes examples of projects, strategies and the background to the project. This program aims to encourage large-scale restoration projects in all countries through these 10 actions. These actions are for governments, community, business, the non-government sector and individuals. Of these actions, I'd like to focus on these 3, which I see as critical impediments to large-scale restoration in Australia. In Australia, we have a boom or bust approach to revegetation and restoration. We sometimes have big programs that empower the community and fund great works on the ground. Think Bob Hawke's 1 billion trees or the early iterations of the Natural Heritage Trust. At other times, we switch off public funding for years at a time or direct this funding to very specific projects. The result is a restoration industry which can barely get off the ground before its wings are clipped again. These groups here form the restoration sector, with an industry component made up of seed collectors, nurseries, contractors and advisors. The nursery industry is a huge industry, mainly servicing the garden and horticulture markets, with plants for restoration making up a small fraction. Contractors may provide one or more services such as weed control, ground preparation, fencing, planting, guarding and watering. Advisors include both the private and public sectors and may include ecological consultants, planting contractors, mine environmental officers, land care coordinators and the like. And these are some of the examples of constraints within this sector that make it difficult to suddenly scale up for large restoration projects. The seed collectors. Seed collection is a skilled job requiring lots of knowledge of locations and timing to be successful. In regional areas, it can be very difficult to quickly find suitable workers and train them to the standard required. Specialised equipment is expensive and will not be purchased unless there is some sort of likelihood of ongoing demand. In many areas, it is difficult to find wild stands of many species, and there is increasing competition for these sites. The response of many plants to climate variability makes it difficult to predict availability. Nurseries have finite bench space and skilled labour and limited windows when seedlings can be grown. It can take a substantial investment to increase nursery capacity. Contractors who can prepare the ground or spray weeds have limited capacity, often working in many other sectors, and to scale up requires investment in expensive equipment and finding skilled labour, often in competition with agriculture, mining or forestry. Advisors such as consulting ecologists are often called upon to design and manage large-scale restoration projects without having the necessary experience to ensure success. There are few training grounds for these skills. Regulators often lack the flexibility to adapt to sudden increases in restoration works in relation to licensing or assessing restoration plans. And the research community cannot quickly respond to the questions from industry, and they require funding to do so. Communication with industry is often poor due to a lack of networks between the two sectors and the requirements to publish in inaccessible scientific journals. The seed collection sector provides a useful example of the capacity constraints of the industry. Seed collection requires a broad range of skills and extensive experience to know where and when to collect seeds. The range of skills includes plant identification, collection methods, cleaning and processing, pest control, mechanical skills and navigation. Seeds are often available in a very narrow period once a year, usually between Christmas and New Year, and then not again until the following year. Not all species produce seeds every year, and they may produce them at different times in response to seasonal conditions. There are limited sites to collect seeds from natural stands, and there can be intense competition for sites on public land. In extensively cleared landscapes, this can make it impossible to get sufficient seeds from local healthy populations. In New South Wales at least, licensing prevents collectors from opportunistic collection of many species when they are available, instead insisting that seeds are collected with a specific planting site in mind. Collection practices which produce high quality seeds, such as collection from multiple plants that are widely spaced, are expensive and beyond the capacity of many collectors, particularly when there is no premium for such seed. As things stand, the lack of consistent and predictable demand for seed in most regions leaves the seed sector as a cottage industry akin to firewood collection, where people drop in and out as work demands. And forgive this rough drawing, but I'm an ecologist, not an artist. In the NRM sector and the restoration sector, much of the work is funded by government or as a result of regulation and government policy. Funding goes in boom and bust cycles at the whim of the government of the day and the policies they implement. The timetable of funding is almost always linked to political goals, such as elections, rather than natural cycles. Policies such as the New South Wales Government Biodiversity Offset Scheme are currently driving a surge in revegetation. We've also recently seen a surge in donations through philanthropic organisations and conservation NGOs directed at koalas and bushfire recovery. Plants do not always produce seed crops every year, and the crop may vary considerably year to year in quantity and quality. This black line here could be seed production from one species, say Eucalyptus albans or Acacia pendula. If we're lucky, the quantity of seed will match the demand generated by available funding, the red line, such as in Year 12. But usually periods of funding coincide with poor crops, such as Years 7 to 9, or seed is available when there is no demand, such as in Year 5. These constraints can result in poor species selection, use of very poor quality seedlots, or delays or postponements of projects. Both Eucalyptus albans and Acacia pendula are the keystone species in their communities, so if they are not available, the project cannot go ahead. This is a typical timetable for a spring planted revegetation project. Seed is mostly collected over summer, then seedlings are started in late summer and grown through winter. Ripping or ground preparation is done 6 to 10 months in advance to allow soil moisture to build up. Weeds are managed as they appear with a final effort just prior to planting. The seedlings are collected from the nursery and planted in November. Then important watering and follow-up weed control happens through summer. But in reality, this is what often happens. Funding for a project is suddenly available, or the minister waits until a month before the election to announce it. And we're very sorry, but this has to be spent by October to fit in with our processes. The project misses a number of species because seed is not available. The nursery delivers seedlings that aren't quite big enough for planting, and many die. The weeds weren't fully controlled, so there is a mass germination straight after planting. The planting was done in September, and the late frost killed a lot of seedlings. An example is the recent injection of funding to carry out revegetation for koalas. 2 nurseries on the coastal strip of New South Wales were given large orders for koala food trees to be grown within one season. There was no time for additional seed collection, so only tree species that the nurseries had seed stock for were grown. These were then offered to landholders right through the fire-affected areas, when many of the species were not appropriate for the area or even for koalas. Seed supply strategies are one solution to address some of the constraints of scaling up to meet large-scale targets. Strategies are plans developed to ensure regional projects have enough seed of the right quality to meet restoration targets. These targets may be based on specific restoration prescriptions for different vegetation communities and may estimate the number of hectares of each community to be established annually using these prescriptions. This allows the quantity of seed required for each species to be calculated and identify constraints such as irregular fruiting, lack of collection sites or dormancy. The quantity of seed required for each species will depend on the revegetation method, direct seeding, seedlings or assisted regeneration, and factors such as viability and dormancy. The strategy can identify where seeds can be collected from and identify access constraints or target those sites which are at risk of being lost. Important sites can be protected or enhanced to increase seed production. In many regions, the lack of sites for suitable seed collection may indicate the necessity for seed production areas to take the pressure off wild stands. Most importantly, a regional seed supply strategy can assess the capacity of the industry to deliver the required quantities of seed and identify ways to overcome constraints such as training, industry development, grants and loans, or shared infrastructure such as seed banks. Finally, if we are to contribute to industry development, grants and loans, or shared infrastructure such as seed banks. Finally, if we are to contribute to the ambitious goals of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration in Australia, we need to develop more capacity within the restoration sector. To do this, we must provide more predictable investment in restoration projects over longer timeframes and in line with natural, not political cycles. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Paul and David, for your insights. I'd now like to introduce the next speaker and thank him for so capably stepping up to facilitate the entire afternoon session today. Damian Wrigley is the National Coordinator of the ASBP, Australia's national focal point for the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation under the CBD, and the Oceania representative to the CITES Plants Committee. Damian is hosted by the Australian National Botanic Gardens on Ngunnawal country. Welcome, Damian.
Thanks, Amelia. Just make sure I can work this like everybody else. Okay, there we go. So thanks. There's been some great talks in this session already and earlier today. What I'd like to do is provide a bit of a perspective from my time working for the Australian Seed Bank Partnership on what conservation seed banks can offer for the UN decade. So for me, it's really easy to get up here and talk about what we do. All of the work is done by the incredible partners and associates across the partnership. It's an amazingly dedicated group of people overseen by the Council of Heads of Australian Botanic Gardens. And it really is a strategic network. You know, we can do what we do because we have a diversified network across the country, all complementing each other rather than trying to compete to do the same things. So we've got over 13 partners, like Brad mentioned today. It's a really important group. And one of the things that we like to do is every couple of years we do an audit of our facilities to understand what we actually are achieving, what we can do, the kind of people we have in our seed banks, and the expertise that we have in them. So we just recently undertook the audit, and this was used in the germplasm guidelines. It's a great figure, and thanks to Amelia and Cam Graphics for letting us use it. It just gives a really simple, clear picture representation of the kind of facilities we have in our partnership, as well as some of the other associates and some of the other ex situ conservation facilities around the landscape. Cool. It's just really important for us to be able to do this. Our partners use this information so they can understand what their capabilities are, but many of our partners have also used this information to justify increases to their funding models within their organisations. They use it to justify getting new facilities, upgrades to seed banks, and also new roles within their institutions. So some of the perspectives that I've come to realise that I've formed in my work, and I'm sure people might have different views of these, but for me, the whole restoration sector, the conservation restoration sector, it's really complex, and there isn't one size that fits all, and that's whether it's a facility or whether it's a program, whether it's research, whether it's a funding model, whatever it might be. Even across our facilities, we have some of the most world-class facilities. I know a lot of people here today have already talked about Plant Bank and others. You know, massive big facilities. We have others that are working out of restoration sheds. We've got others that are in old curators' cottages and soon to be updated. But, you know, the things they're doing are still world-class. Time and capacity is obviously a big one for all of us. We're all pressed for time. We're all pressed for capacity. We're all struggling to get funding, regardless of whether you're operating within a government sector, whether you're in the private sector. There's always pressures on our time. One of the things, the conversations through Project Phoenix, and I had a great time being involved in that and being engaged on the external steering committee. But some of the conversations we had with consultants and others was, you know, the conservation sector only does threatened species, restoration sector only does common species, and the two never blend. But that's not true, and I know a lot of people here would know that too. And I think some of the things that, you know, put this in stark contrast is things like myrtle rust, things like climate change, things that were common yesterday are no longer common. The fires have shown us that, you know, massive crises, massive threats can come at any time. So we need to be banking everything. We need to be making sure that we understand everything, whether it's common, whether it's threatened, and we need to be sharing that across each other. Funding and expertise is another big one, making sure that we're making time available for the seed science. So understanding seed biology and ecology is critical. If we don't know that information, then we can't use them in SPAs, we can't use seed in restoration work. But also making sure that when we're doing the work, we're using agreed standards. So things like the SARA standards, the germplasm guidelines, translocation guidelines, flora bank guidelines, these things are really important for us as a sector to be sharing that information that we're learning along the way, making sure that it's being published, but then disseminating it. And Amelia and others are doing a great job of making sure that kind of information is getting out there. And like we've just heard from Paul and Martin and others, a national plan for the sector, both across conservation and restoration, is absolutely critical in taking that next step and being able to deliver against things like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I guess what I'd like to do is provide for us in the conservation sector what we do and what we're trying to contribute at the international level, then the national and then local. So most people here would have heard of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the CBD is now in the process of developing the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Meetings were held just last week in Geneva, going through till 3 in the morning, those poor people, but negotiating on what these new targets will be to replace the IHU targets. But we also had some great success getting text in there so that a third decade of the global strategy for plant conservation can continue, and that text will be taken to the COP, the Conference of the Parties in Kunming in China later this year. And it's really important for us in the botanic gardens and seed banking world, in the restoration sector, in research, in community groups, Indigenous managed lands, anyone working on plants. It's been a really important strategy for us, and it's really promising to see that go forward. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration obviously is very important, and the Restoration Decade Alliance that's been developed in Australia, established out of the Ecosystem Restoration, Ecological Restoration Conference last year in Darwin, is an important alliance that hopefully will really make some big strides in helping us to collectively work together to deliver on those targets. It's going to be a hard push. I'm sure there'll be plenty of targets in there that we're just being overly ambitious, but it's better to be overly ambitious than try and underachieve. The conservation sector in Australia couldn't have done what it's done without the support of the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership. They built capacity in the early years throughout Australia, and they continue to support us and others in the region. They facilitated a great amount of funding coming through to us after the bushfires. They still provide opportunities for training. They're a really important partner internationally for this work. There's 100 countries that work with them on their projects, so it's critical to the work we do. And Botanic Gardens Conservation International is going from strength to strength as well with what they're doing, not just looking after botanic gardens, but supporting restoration work, particularly in developing nations around the world. When it comes to the national priorities, there's ones that we all know, like the Threatened Species Strategy, and they're important for giving us some direction. There's the legislative frameworks, there's the Threatened Species Committees, and then there's the documents that come out of that work. But I think we need to also give credit where credit's due. So things like the draft action plan for myrtle rust. It might only be a draft action plan. It might not have been adopted formally yet, but you can't understate the influence that that document has had on some of the work that's going into things like the new action plan for the Threatened Species Strategy. A lot of us are already working towards some of the recommendations and the targets in that draft action plan. But the more formal things that have been mentioned here already, the standards for ecological restoration, the guidelines out of APCC, it's almost becoming too many to count now, but it's so important that we have these and keep working towards them. But I think also taking advantage of those opportunities like the Bushfire Expert Panel and what came out of there and the prioritisation done by Rachel and others, that was really important work for being able to galvanise action. Hats off to government funders, philanthropy, to overseas funders, and Rachel, we had some great discussions early on about what we should be doing for prioritisation. And I know when people hear these kind of things, they hear prioritisation, that's the list we've got to work on. But people were flexible and they recognised that we can actually build local targets, local priorities into the work that we're doing while we're trying to hit these priority targets. That was really critical for the outcomes from ASPP that Brad presented on earlier today. And of course, Project Phoenix has also been an important one for us as well. But most critically, and I think it's coming through in quite a few talks today, and I'm sure it will again in the next couple of days, is it's that local knowledge, it's the local priorities that are really critical. So our seed banks, the staff in our seed banks go out there all the time, they're in the field, they're talking to community groups, they're making relationships with land managers, Indigenous, government, private landholders, they're working with land care groups, landowners, restoration practitioners like those in the room today. But it's also those researchers, the collectors, the volunteers, citizen scientists. All of these people, all of these actions are feeding into the work of conservation seed banks, just like in the restoration field. So I guess just two examples that I wanted to give that have come out of conservation seed banks in our partnership. This one's from Kings Park, and I'm sure some of you have seen it before, but a lot of the work that they're doing is feeding into the restoration of mine sites up north in WA, where we're talking about huge landscapes, absolutely massive areas that need to be restored. So, leaning on some of that technological advances when we collaborate with universities, looking at the sorts of things that we can do for seed treatment, looking at the technologies that we can use for those broad-scale restoration actions, that's really critical for what we're trying to achieve. But at the same time, it's going back and ensuring that the entire process, and I thank Dave Merritt for talking to me about this element of the work. It's actually making sure that the planning is right from the beginning. It's making sure that the collecting is done properly, that the storage is done properly, that we're understanding the germination cues, that we can break dormancy, that we're storing seed properly the whole way through. And then it's making sure that these technologies will do what they're meant to do, that we're planting things at the right time, we're using the right treatments, we're putting them in at the right place, the right time, to make sure that we get the emergence that we want. So it's everything together, it's not any silver bullet. This other example I wanted to show has come out of the bushfire funding that we've got recently. So the one at the top, this is Kangaroo Island, and this is a real community partnership that's happening. So they're developing a seed production area. It's 100 by 50 metres squared, so it is small by restoration standards. It's going to have hundreds of plants in it, anywhere from 30 to 40 threatened plants at any one time, but they're not just threatened plants under legislation. These are plants that are just known to be threatened locally as well. So this partnership is really important for taking a landscape, a property that's owned by Nature Foundation in South Australia, and they've adapted an agricultural landscape for conservation. So they haven't just gone out and cleared a bunch of trees, don't worry, they were already gone. But these sorts of things are really important for showing the expertise that are in seed banks, working with the local community to then go out and start restoring the landscapes in areas like KI that have been really heavily impacted. But then you've got these really small ones as well, and I don't think we should discount these ones. The bottom left, this is Billy Goat Hill up in the hills in Adelaide. We had Glycine latrobiana was wiped out in this property, and it was because of a seed collection back in 2009 that was made by the South Australian team. They didn't have the capacity to store those seeds back then, so they sent them off to the Millennium Seed Bank in the UK. Straight after the fires, they requested those seeds to be returned to them. They germinated them in Adelaide, they grew those plants on, and then they were able to reintroduce them back into this property. And it might only be small scale, but when you've got these mosaic of private landholders, and like what we heard about earlier today with Victoria, focusing on private landholders, it's these small ones that will eventually be having a bigger impact as we go forward. So I guess for me, I sort of see two critical roles. Conservation seed banks have a critical role of capturing that genetic diversity, and across our network, our goal collectively is to have everything in Australia represented, not just a collection of a species, but the whole genetic diversity of those species across their distribution. And when it comes to restoration seed banks, for me, the way that I like to think of it is, it's the utilisation of collections, whether they're in the conservation or restoration sector, but actually having that landscape scale ecosystem impact. And I think it's really important that the two are working together to make sure that we can achieve that. So just reiterating, like others have said, coordination is absolutely key to this. I'm not trying to blow my own horn, but this role, having a coordination point for conservation seed banks, has been really important for helping us to coordinate across the partnership, but also being able to talk to funders, to governments, to communities, whatever it might be. It's actually a really important role. And the sector across the board needs more of this, I think, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 10, the ideal sort of situation. I think these roles are critical. And for me, respect, it's a big one. So it's not just about respecting traditional owners, it's about respecting each other. So it's about respecting restoration seed banks, conservation seed banks, researchers, funders, government, whatever it might be. I think there's a great example here already. We've seen so many talks of collaboration and respect, and I think that's just such an important key in this, in making sure we can move forward. For me, ecosystem restoration, it requires diversity and complexity, but it's not just about the species, it's about those people that are engaged. So ensuring that we're bringing everyone in to try and solve these problems. There's been plenty of examples of that today, the collaboration across the projects post-bushfires. It's those little bits of expertise across everyone that makes things so successful. And the survey for me, one of the points that I took out of the native seed survey was, we have over 23,000, 26,000 native species in Australia, but we just can't get the diversity out of the seed production areas. And I think that's the key area where conservation seed banks can really help, is making sure that we have these species across the entire flora available in seed banks. Yes, it might take time to bulk up these small collections, But if we don't have that diversity there, if we don't have that material already in place, then the restoration sector is never going to be able to achieve anything. So yeah, capturing it now, it's absolutely fundamental. If we don't do it, we're never going to get there. So I'll just keep supporting this space as much as I can, and I welcome anybody. Come and have a talk to me. Send me an email. Hit us up on social media, whatever it is. We've got partners all over the country, and at different times they can take on a range of different projects, whether that's collecting seed, storing seed, doing the research, helping with translocations and restoration, or assisting with developing guidelines and standards. And I just want to say thank you to the Council of Heads of Australian Botanic Gardens for continuing to support us, our volunteers and our funders. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Damian. And it's the ASBP has done such great work over almost 20 years now, and a lot of that is due to coordinators like Damian who just take the partnership from strength to strength. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Libby Rumpff. Libby is a plant ecologist at the University of Melbourne with a focus on the restoration and adaptive management of native woodlands. She works closely with government agencies to improve decision making under uncertainty. Welcome, Libby.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. I'd like to first acknowledge that a lot of the any data and work that was collected during this project was on Yorta Yorta and Tangerang country, so I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to acknowledge that this was a collaboration with the Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority, and I've got, so Jim Begley was a big driver of this project. And all of the land care facilitators are also up on this slide. And I'm going to talk about a couple or a few projects that are kind of brought together, the planets have aligned a bit. So there's some work in here that I want to talk to that Chris Jones and Megan Good, who were at the University of Melbourne at the time, were leading as well. So I also want to thank the organisers for squishing me into this section, because I was going to talk about bringing people together, but I can't be here tomorrow, so thanks very much. But I am going to talk about setting goals and how we meet these ambitious restoration targets. And in order to meet a restoration goal such as that has been outlined by the UN, we first need to be able to say, okay, well, where are we and where do we want to go? And then, and in saying that, I think we've done a lot of good work as a collective to sort of say, well, what makes a good objective? So it's about outlining good objectives. But then the second one is about, well, how do we know that actually we're getting there, or we've got there? How do we know that we're actually going to hit these targets? And that's where monitoring comes into play. And I think that is a space that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, to have a good coordinated approach to developing, measurable monitoring strategies that tell us something about what our goals and what our objectives are doing and whether we've met them or not. So that's the context for this talk. In saying that, I think the Australian National Audit Office has said, and I'll scream if they say it again, we don't know if the investment in restoration is effective or not. So they say that time and time again. So I think there's good justification there for saying, well, we don't have good monitoring strategies to underpin that. But I'm not going to put that straight on the people developing the monitoring strategies, because I think there's lots of good work being done. In fact, we're relying on short-term funding cycles and the ability to fund long-term monitoring to understand and learn about what we're doing and understand whether we're hitting those targets or not is a serious issue. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a threatened ecological community, woodlands. So Australian woodlands sort of constitute some of the most extensive ecosystems in Australia, but also some of the most exploited. So they often coincide with really productive land, and so historically they've been cleared a lot and continue to be cleared and continually degraded due to grazing, agriculture, and so on. And there's been, you know, huge interruptions to the you know, what we would have seen in terms of fire and flooding regimes in these sort of ecosystems. So as a result, many of the these woodland ecosystems are now listed under the EPBC Act, and I'm going to talk today about woodlands in southern Australia, temperate eucalyptus woodlands, and there's 24 of those that are listed currently under the EPBC Act, but Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong. I think I can count. And, you know, I think it's 16 of those are critically endangered. So it's pretty dire for woodlands. Now, they occur, you know, so I think this is to highlight really the importance of working with landholders in order to try and improve the condition and the extent of these communities of woodlands as a whole. And so the Goulburn Broken have been working for a long time now with landholders in their catchment to try and do exactly this. And this is just one example of a funding program, and it's called Linking Landscapes and Communities project. It's funded under Landcare, and it's a 5-year restoration problem. And so this is project. So it is funded. It's aiming to improve the condition of those grey box grassy woodlands and derived native grasslands, which are listed. And yeah, as I said, the target is to improve the condition of these woodlands, but there's an additional target, or there's an additional recognition really, that in order to do this and to do this effectively and successfully, it also relies on trying to improve social license, improve community awareness of the values and the management of this community and the associated species. So if we just backtrack like 10 years or something, in 2011 we released a paper, so it was, you know, before that, we started working with the Goulburn Broken before that, on a state and transition model. And it was a quantitative model to support adaptive management. It was kind of a proof of concept idea, but we're going to talk about the conceptual version of this and how we're moving that forward in terms of underpinning goals and underpinning a monitoring strategy. So it's perfect for these fragmented agricultural landscapes because there's these discrete patches and it recognises that these patches might have different starting conditions. And so what you do to those sites, it depends on what the starting condition is. So what management that you apply to an exotic pasture is going to look very different to the management that you apply if you've got a thicket on your hands or if you've got a pretty good patch of remnant bush. So it recognises that there's these different motivations for management. You might have different goals on where you expect to go in the time frame that you've got available, and it also helps sort of represent that there are different threats and different risks that could push you in a direction that you weren't intending to go or you didn't want to go. So that is kind of the backbone for this approach, and Jim Begley took that kind of thinking and used it to try and set some goals for this particular program. And so it was saying, okay, for the grey box woodlands in the Goulburn Broken, what we're going to do is we're going to actively manage to improve condition to try and move a bunch of what we consider degraded states, so recognising that there's a bunch of different states in the landscape, and we're trying to take those states and we're kind of going to try and improve them into these into what we consider a more improved condition state. Now that's just a lot of words, and you'll notice it says, state stage 4 to 3. So the only point there is that clearly my names are rubbish on the initial model. So what we had to do next was we worked with the land care facilitators who were really instrumental in this program. So these land care facilitators are the ones that are working with the landholders to undertake the management, to communicate the goals for their site, and so on. And so we worked with the land care facilitators to, iterate this original conceptual model, and we developed an information guide to sort of represent, well, what are the different states that exist in the landscape, and then what are the risks for these sites? And it was really a communication tool that could be taken to landholders and I'll just show you a few examples, or just one example really. So this is one of the, I keep looking behind me, it's right here. There's a page for each of the sort of condition states. We added an original state from the original model. We renamed them so that they worked for the people who were trying to communicate what was being done. And so for each of these states, there's a few pictures and there's a description of what this state looks like. So you can say, okay, well, this is where we are. And this is typically how we would characterise your site. And then there would be another page that sort of says, okay, so you're in exotic modified now. Our aim is to take you to this next state, which is a native modified state. So that's our aim. And you can see that there's a bunch of management options there that can say these are the sort of actions that we're going to be applying to the state in order to get us there. But you can also see that there's some risks, those red arrows. So you can say there is a chance that we're not going to go anywhere in the time frame for a number of different reasons. And those reasons could be outside of the control of the management that's being applied. There's a drought, or it could be within the control. There's not enough follow-up we control. It could be due to the landholders' action. So it's really also a way of saying, okay, if you do graze, there's a chance that we're going to go backwards, not go anywhere or go backwards. So this was a tool to sort of communicate goals, risks, and actions. Now, the next important step there, and I'm just going to keep an eye on time, is about monitoring. I'm going to try and squish both of these into one talk, because this is the next stage in the process was the land care facilitators, were on the ground and getting out there and monitoring baseline condition. What was the starting point, and then monitoring that through time. So I'll have to come back and explain some of the outcomes, because I'm not going to focus on those today. So in order to do that, it was about setting up. No, I'm going to stop. I'm going to talk about targeted monitoring for a second. So I think when we do monitoring for vegetation condition, we monitor a lot of stuff, right? And I think there's some efficiencies that we can make. And so I think it's about saying, okay, well, what are the attributes that help us define, if we're using this state and transition modelling approach, that tell us whether we're in one state or we're in another state. And so some of the work that Chris and I had been doing with the Goulburn Broken, we've collected a big data set. So when we're trying to get people to monitor change over time on the ground, we don't have a whole lot of data. We're sort of saying, we think we're going this way. We think this is, this is what this state might look like. And so this was about pooling data sets together to say, well, what do these states actually look like? And what are the attributes that vegetation attributes that we should put into a monitoring program to say whether we're going in one direction or another direction? And more importantly, or as important, what are the thresholds that tell us whether we've made a change, whether we've met that target for that site or not? And so some of the work that Chris and I had been doing was specific to the Goulburn Broken. It was setting up an approach. The work's been accepted in ecological applications, but there's a preprint online if you want to have a look. And then Megan Good took this work and tried to expand it and says, well, what do these condition states actually look like in woodlands, eucalypt woodlands in southern Australia, across the country? So she was really amassing, big data sets to try and pull out pull out commonalities in, well, what are those attributes that tell us whether we're in one state or another, and what do these states actually look like? Okay, so the takeaway, we looked at different woodland sort of types with a focus, we had a focus, of course, on grassy woodlands, and we used this classification regression tree analysis to sort of say, you put the data in, it says, okay, well, where does the data fall out and what's the threshold? And what we found is that there are a set of attributes that really can be useful in detecting change over time: tree density, exotic understory cover, native understory cover, and we can reduce that and target it, and it can be specific to different states. So we took that approach back to the Goulburn Broken case study, and we used that data to sort of say, okay, well, here are the states. This table outlines that these are the initial states that we had in the landscape, and the goal states that we were trying to get to, and what the thresholds are that might indicate for a small set of attributes that whether we've made that change or not. I've got that graph there just so you know. I'm not going to say it's 34% native ground cover that tells you you're 1% either side. You're not there. There is a threshold around that can tell us something about change over time. Okay, so that. Yeah, this is, I will have to come back and do round two because I do have to wrap up, I know. So I think that the take-home messages from this is about an approach that we're trialling to sort of say, how do we set goals and use targeted monitoring underpinned by state and transition models? And clearly, this sort of approach and monitoring at this scale requires partnerships with landowners, and I think the role of the land care facilitators in developing this approach so that it was fit for purpose was pretty critical. And we can also use these state and transition models as a way of underpinning targeted monitoring strategies, recognising, I know, that in order to learn and to report on our outcomes, we do need longer term investment in monitoring. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Libby. It's great to hear some support for monitoring. It's an often overlooked element of the work we do. So I fully support your sentiments there. Okay, so before we move on to the question and answer session, we're going to do a Mentimeter poll, but I will be in big trouble if I don't mention the Australian Seedbank Partnership is doing a review of its collections across the entire country, and we will be looking for a data analyst very shortly. So if anyone's interested in analysing data about Australia's seed collections, please feel free to reach out and talk to me. So we're just going to do a couple more Mentimeter questions, if you're ready to go, Amelia. Okay, so enter the code, take a photo, get online, and please hit the love heart as soon as you've done it so we know that you're all on there. Share the love. Another couple of seconds to get on. All right. So the strategy for the Australian native seed sector sets 6 strategic objectives. Please choose your 3 main areas of interest. So market coordination, sector leadership, information sharing, quality, smarter regulation and new industries. So you've only got 3. Good share there between information sharing and quality, followed by sector leadership and smarter regulation. A couple more seconds on that one. It's close. Market coordination and smarter regulation. All right. Last chance. Okay, next one please, Amelia. So this next question, what will you do or continue doing to support the restoration decade? I see some mad tapping of thumbs. Give you a little bit longer on this one. It's always harder when it's not multiple choice. All right, we're starting to get a few responses come up. And as we start seeing the same responses come up, the word cloud will make one or two words larger than others. Education, research and communication seem to be leading. All right, keep them coming. Research seems to be in the lead. If you disagree, get your submission in. All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds on this one. It's getting harder to see them. I hope they're coming through clearly on the big one. But it's good to see some of those words like collaboration, engagement, volunteers, monitor. Libby, that got in there for you? All right. We'll finish up on that one and we'll go to one last question. So tomorrow we have a showcase of tools for supporting restoration. What do you see as key tools, resources or knowledge needs to assist restoration? Cultural knowledge and tools. Got Aboriginal knowledge come up. A few more coming through now. Seed collection, spatial analysis and data. Funding's a big one. Plant ID, very important. Identifying seed needs, quality, viability. Okay, some more of the education and engagement side. Monitoring's got in again. Is that just scrolling by itself, is it? Okay, keep them coming so it scrolls faster. Okay, a bit of research coming in. Oh, yep, labour supply leadership, it's very important. Go to Knowledge Hub. Yeah, more funding, more seed collection, that's good. That's great, we'll give you a couple more seconds on this one. These will all keep Amelia going for at least another week. All right, we'll wrap that one up. Get your last submissions in. All right, thanks very much, everyone. Getting that feedback from you is really helpful. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to a little bit of a Q&A session. So we've got a few of the panel members here in person that presented today. So we've got Martin, we've got Libby and myself. And I think we might be getting a few people online. Oh, we've got Sam. Welcome, Sam. Lovely to have you. Sorry you couldn't be here with us. And we've got David Carr and we've got Paul Gibson Roy as well. Thanks for your presentations. They all came through. Great to have you on the panel. So we'll open the floor. I think we've got a couple of roving mics. We've got Brad over here and we've got Chris over here. So throw your hands up and we'll get started. Yeah, we've got Karen down the front here.
It's a question for Paul. Hi, Paul. I just wanted to know what you put the lack of seed diversity in the restoration sector down to. Is it a case of not being able to collect species or more a case of not being able to germinate the seed?
Okay, I'm presuming you can hear me now, I hope so. Look, I would put it down to really, it's come down to our programs. So for 30 or 40 years, our funded programs have really been targeted at a simplistic suite of tree and shrub type programs, and we really haven't been asked to gear up for diversity. So sure, being able to germinate things, being able to access things, so there are issues with licensing, as I spoke to as well. All those things come into the mix. But if we had more targeted and well-defined policy that said we have a target for restoration in a region or nationally where we want to incentivise high diversity, and we signal that to the market well in advance, and the funding is, over multiple decades, then we will see an increase in diversity as people, gear up and meet those goals. But over the last 30 or 40 years, the sector is really being simplistically asked to collect a few tree and shrub species, as Dave pointed out, and you throw the boom and bust into that, and that just complicates it more.
May I also add to that? I think it's also, as you say, Paul, that's the issue, but it's also compounded by economics as well, I think, to a degree at the moment, that it's just not viable for people to collect a huge array of seed and have it sitting there if it's very rarely asked for or used.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Martin. As people have been talking about strategies and establishing goals and things, that's absolutely critical. As Dave Carr pointed out, you need long-term assessment and projections for restoration, but that's only a part of the step. Then you've got to have well-defined budgets that enable those targets to be met. And if you don't have a budget to meet that goal, then revise your goal and match your budgets to it. But if those things are in place, then you can start to build a sector. You're not getting boom and bust. You're getting people investing in infrastructure, training people, building up capacity. That's the only way we're going to do this over time, with that more certainty around goals, but also fully funded targets.
Thanks, Paul and Martin. We've got another couple of questions. I think this one was first in the middle here, but while the microphone's getting there, just a reminder for people online, use the chat function. You can submit a question and we'll have it read out for you. Thanks.
Hi.
Yep.
Hi, my question's for Libby. I'm interested in that communication pack that you sent out to landholders and the perception of risk. So I'm just wondering what people thought about that communication pack and if it worked, if it was effective.
I think this is where I look to Andy and Jim, because Andy, Jim, what do you reckon?
Chris, could we get a microphone? Thanks.
It was fantastic to have something to hand to a landowner, to say there was a strategy behind what we were wanting to do, and they could see where it was going to progress to, and that on its own was really worthwhile. So generally, really well received. Was that what I was supposed to say?
That was perfect.
I think, does this work? I think the visuals also helped, because those visuals actually went into their agreements as well. So they were signing on to something that they're just not signing on to words. They're signing on to, here is my starting point, and here's a photo of what it might look like, or what we're both sort of agreeing to. And then we've got annual milestone reports each year. So landholders then send in their photos, updated photos each year of what the progress has been. So they're sort of more, they're more signed up for 10 years. It's a 10-year management agreement as well. So they're committed, yeah. And the feedback that we get from those annual milestone reports, you can tell that they're committed, yeah.
I think, Sean, did you have a question?
I hope this isn't contentious. This is for everybody. Scale and funding has come up a lot, and I wonder if someone would feel comfortable commenting on the role of industry, particularly large-scale mining, because maybe they have a role as leaders in this sector. What do you think?
I think we should give that to Martin and Sam.
Yeah, look, I would start with that, and happy for Sam to fill in. One of the things that we found, particularly in New South, well, really, it started in Western Australia. Mining, the seed industry really has fed the mining industry has fed the seed industry in Western Australia. In New South Wales, the emergence of coal in particular, the surveys have showed the most seed is going to the coal industry and restoration in the coal industry. Again, it's a very narrow range of seed because it's not viable and they're not interested in the wide range. So yes, I think it does act as a potential springboard if there's coordination and compliance between organisations and mining industries. One, if you've got seed production areas, you've got land, you've got capability to produce more seed, that can then go into adding to the demands or the requirements of the restoration industry and land care and the volunteer side of the sector, which is currently not having sufficient funds and scale. So I think, yes, I think the mining industry has a huge, if there's leadership and coordination at that regional level, but I think it also probably requires some form of stipulation of what requirements needed to set those guidelines to make it happen. But it's something, and Sam, you may want to add to it, given that we've had this discussion over and over.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks, Sean, for the question. I definitely agree that the mining sector does have a role to play. Certainly we had some submissions on the national strategy for the mining sector, and definitely an indication of an interest in a leadership role around implementation for the strategy. So I think there is definitely interest there. But going back to what Martin said, I think it's absolutely right. Their core business isn't seed. You know, our core business is seed. So I think it needs to be coordinated. The message we got from the sector is they are interested in making more of a contribution, but in the end, we need to be going there with solutions. Definitely there needs to be leadership and coordination so that we can bring them into the conversation. And the other thing I would say as well is compliance, because unless there are those frameworks around effective management of native seed, there's not much of an incentive for the mining sector to be engaged. So I think if we can be better organised, then yeah, we can bring them in and we can see them make a much more significant contribution to the sector overall.
My big concern there too is that there's lots of regions in New South Wales where I was working on it where there is no mining, so there is no scale capacity currently. It's public good stuff. And the other concern I have is the other side with the imminent and impending closure of mining, whether you know, the wind down is going to keep the industry going for some time, or whether there's going to be just voluntary liquidations and walkaways. And I would, yeah, that is a concern of mine, because I know companies have just declared themselves bankrupt and disappeared with their assets without meeting obligations.
Could I just add my experience? We've had some really good leadership from the mining industry at times. I'm thinking of Alcoa in Western Australia. They were very public with a lot of their research that they did. We had the Australian Centre for Mine Environmental Rehabilitation, ACMER, in Queensland, which was very active, leading a lot of information sharing in restoration and seed use. But these days, the mines I work with in New South Wales, they're very much just want to get on with their own thing. They're not interested in being part of a broader seed sector. The real positive that they have is that they create a market, and a consistent market, which then allows seed collectors to build capacity and invest in equipment and resources that they need to do it properly. So a much bigger scale than the environmental sector in this part of the world. So it would be really nice if, as part of their regulation, that they were required to share some of the information that they do generate through their work.
Can I jump in as well? Since we're all going on this one. Look, I have spoken to some environmental officers from coal mines in New South Wales recently, And they've said to me that a big change in the landscape for them has been some change in the regulation around offsetting. And now there is some capacity in New South Wales for mines to use their rehab as part of their offset obligation, or to meet part of their offset obligation, provided the rehab meets certain metrics. So that creates a completely new incentive for the miners to improve the type of restoration that they're doing, to ask for more diversity, to actually have clear targets around ecological goals. So I would see that as a move in the right direction. I would also just add in parting that I have until recently been associated with a prospective mine project in Victoria, where the company there was looking to set a standard around restoration, which is, to my knowledge, rarely achieved, looking to restore, hundreds and hundreds of hectares of nationally threatened community, forests and wetlands, things like this, that actually were not part of their obligation whatsoever. And my experience with that whole process was that the regulators themselves, and I would say Earth Resources Regulator, who is the mine regulating agency, and DELP in Victoria, were completely non-supportive of that company in that instance of actually achieving those goals. So while we hear regulators jumping up and down and people jumping up and down and saying we want mine companies to do X, Y or Z, those agencies themselves have to actually get some skin in the game and actually work with mining companies to help them achieve them where they're wanting to go above and beyond. And as I said, my experience was that those agencies were effectively undermining, that particular company, and as a result, that program will not go ahead. And I think that's a hugely perverse outcome. So, and the last point I would make is that don't rely too much on mines. If you put all the mines in Australia together, they're not going to have a monstrous footprint. We still really need to make the best use of agricultural land and potentially as well the vast amounts of land along our road and transport corridors. So they occupy a much larger footprint, and I think we keep reverting back to mines because we think those people have money and they should do it. We should be shifting our gaze back to where in other countries they've provided incentives for road agencies and farmers to economically put native vegetation onto much larger tracts of land. And in Australia, I think we've completely missed that boat.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to move on to a couple of other questions. I think I saw Rachel's hand up first a while back, and then Joe. Have we got any online ones yet? No. Okay.
Sorry, I'm not going to move on. I'm just going to reinforce something that we are undergoing at the moment: reform of the EPBC Act, and this is, a very big reform program that's going on, to our premier piece of environmental legislation in Australia, and there are opportunities within that for us to put pressure on our local members, the Environment Minister, to bring in enforceable national standards for biodiverse plantings. And so although we're seeing enforceable standards being put forward for other areas of national environmental significance, we can actually push for science to be injected into the EPBC Act reform process. And I would, advocate to everyone to not see it as something that has to be up to mining companies or private practice or research or whatever. It's actually, if we want to see reforms which are enforceable, then we really do need to start talking to politicians and telling them exactly what's what and what needs to be in the kind of standards that we want to see in the EPBC Act, because it's not going to be looked at again for another decade, I'd say, if we're lucky. So this is our big shot. So I'd be putting time and resources, no matter who you are, PhD student, right through to professor, practitioner, whoever, talk to your local member and tell them how important it is to have good enforceable standards. And that's how we'll get to a place where we have, legislation that really sets standards that we can all meet and rise to. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks for not moving on, Rachel. That was good. Let's go down the front. And then I think we've got time for one more.
Just a comment to Libby. I'd like to get her feedback on it. In South Australia, we've got a number of grassy woodlands. We've got and grasslands. We've got irongrass grassland, which is critically endangered. We've got peppermint box grassy woodland, which is critically endangered, and we've got grey box, which is endangered, I think. Two big threats. One is planting of shrubs I know examples where grasslands have had shrubs put in it, which have, it's pretty dry environment. That's outcompeted the understory. Similarly, Cullen Parvum in the Southern Lofty Ranges, Shebbs Hill Recreation Park disappeared when they put trees nearby. So that's one threat. And the other threat is mountain bikes. Millions of dollars have been put into mountain bike tracks in, for instance, council reserves in the Adelaide Hills and Mount Remarkable. Big problem is the number of, to have one of these communities, whether it be peppermint box or grey box grassy woodland, protected under the EPBC Act, it must have a certain number of understory species per hectare or unit area. And often these areas have the diversity, but it's over a bigger area. So just wondering if you could comment on those two issues.
Well, I think there was at least three, but I'll start because I think I need to retract one of my comments, which was, we're doing pretty well at setting objectives. So clearly not, because I've heard accounts of where grasslands have been planted out with trees and shrubs and so on, and clearly there are other objectives at play there, I think. So it's either that there isn't a recognition of what that community is and what it should look like, or it's that it's been, used, it's going to be planted out for carbon or, some other kind of, objective. So I think that the first one is really about, I think it just highlights this importance of saying, well, this is what we've got now, but this is actually where we should be aiming for, and having that clear message and that clear story and communication pathway to sort of highlight that, because I think that's the thing that can stop that. But the other thing is recognising where there are different objectives and where there might be trade-offs at play. So if we're dealing in a market which has got production and biodiversity and carbon, it's about trying to say, all right, well, if it is that we're trying to manage this site for all of those things, how do we do it most effectively? And should we, I think, is the question when it comes to planting shrubs and trees in grasslands. For the second one, there was a point in there about mountain bikes and threat as a threatening process, and then the other one was something about scale at which you see understory diversity. Is that right?
So basically, for peppermint box and grassy woodland and all three of those communities I mentioned, all of them need a certain diversity of understory species per unit area to be protected under the Act.
Yeah, right.
But the big problem is often the diversity is there, but it's scattered over a bigger area.
Yeah.
So I guess that's something that needs to be taken into account when you do revegetation, to try and take that into account to protect these communities. Yeah.
Yeah. And yes. Yeah. And the question is, I guess then, it's, is that something that is, we, of course, we should be putting, revegetating understories. And the problem is, particularly with that one, that we can't make an assessment under the Act because we're not meeting a certain target. Is it that the target is wrong, do you think, spatially, or do you think it's that there needs to be more action done to... Sorry, I'll turn this...
Maybe both, but I guess there's got to be a threshold somewhere where really degraded areas don't get resources put into it, and the better priority areas do. On the other hand, if it results in a development occurring because it's not protected under the EPBC Act, then that's a problem.
It's a real problem, and I think, and I think there's a few issues that come up there, and I think it's in terms of data availability, the ability to collect data at scale and to communicate what's going on at scale through time, that's clearly a big issue. I think if we bring it back to this sort of state and transition modelling approach, there's, and I'm not putting it out there as we should all be doing this, but there is a role there, I think, in communicating that yeah, we're not there yet, but this is where we're trying to get to. And actually, you know, maybe that doesn't, I'll talk to Rachel again, but maybe that doesn't meet standards for protection yet. But actually there's a trajectory that we're on, that we're, you know, that we're trying to get there. So yeah, I don't know if I can comment on that one so well, but yeah, I can see the issues.
Thanks, Libby. We've got one over here, Brad.
Paul, what elements, all right, of the Commonwealth's national resource management type budgets might be needed, all right, in fact, you know, to enable your, you know, 10 or 20 years national seed bank program, if you like to call it that, to actually come to fruition?
Was that to me?
Yeah, that was for you, Paul.
Okay, look, I can't see the questionnaire there. I suspect it might be an esteemed gentleman from Canberra. Look, Alan, if it is indeed you, it's a really tricky question. I think we need to redirect, and look, Libby and Dave, and we've all sort of touched on this thing. We have shown that we can restore landscapes. And it's a mix of techniques, you know, it can be assisted regeneration, it can entail plantings, it can entail direct seeding. We have the understanding of those sorts of things. We have some pretty good understanding of seed technologies, we're improving on those over time. The big challenge for us is scaling these things up. And I think that comes back to setting these clear strategic goals at regional, landscape, state and national levels, so that we're getting all those sort of points and saying, okay, well, within a region where you've got the grassy woodlands, this is clearly the community that we need to restore here by whatever techniques. And so it won't be appropriate to be planting trees and shrubs because you've defined well what you're after. But also then saying within that region, we've set a goal of, you know, let's say 1,000 hectares in the next 10 years. And then you've got to have some mechanism to actually achieve that, to signal to both landholders, people who have the land available for that to happen, and they may be programs that, you know, sort of encourage farmers to change their management practices. It might be, you know, programs that do direct seeding on roadsides or on farms, all those things together. But they need to be signal to the market so that, again, in areas, and these are all over southeastern Australia and southwestern Australia, southwestern Australia and the wheat belt, where there isn't enough seed, and you're sending signals to the market so that people can say, okay, in the next 10, 20 years, we know that we're going to be restoring in this region, in this state, X number of hectares. There is a clear dollar tag linked to that. And we're going to invest in this. We're going to put money into building up seed resources, either by banking it or growing it and production. All those things coming together so that you get everyone starting to work together. And in those programs, you're setting clear standards around what you want out of that restoration. So in this particular area, you want high diversity restoration. You want people who are tendering to do that to be able to demonstrate proof of origin of where the seed comes from, for example, or proof of testing of the seed. So in a well-defined, well-structured, well-supported and well-funded model, you can actually lift the standards in the sector. You can set clear parameters around what you're hoping to achieve in terms of diversity, function, composition, and you can send a signal to the market. And again, I think one of the things we've failed in Australia, and our survey picked up on it, there are a lot of commercial operators wanting to get into this market. But as Dave Carr has said, it's a bit like collecting firewood. People go in and out and in and out because there is not a consistent revenue stream. Whereas in places like in America and parts of Europe, because it is such a long-term structured process, People can invest in that, and you get the rise of large commercial operators who still have a really strong interest in the environment. That it's just that they want to also make a living, and you've got career pathways for young people wanting to get into this. Whereas at the moment, we rely so heavily on a very limited range of NGOs and a huge amount of community and volunteer input, all good, but not enough on its own. And I think we need to shift an industry that sends out all those sort of signals that says, okay, if you're commercially orientated, be you a miner or just a little business, you can actually grow in this sector. And until we put all those things together, and it can be done, because it has been done in other parts of the world, and where it's been done successfully, they're talking about achieving millions of hectares of restoration per annum, year in, year out, over preceding decades. Now, that's not something that we can brag about, and it mystifies me that these things are going on in the world and we continue to go forward and essentially ignore that and say, well, whatever we're doing is sort of okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Can I jump in here too?
Yeah, go for it, David. I know I'm never going to be allowed to chair a session again.
This is, look, it really is important to set some regional goals. You've got to have a target to set for the amount of restoration you're going to do in a region, and that comes from policy. That starts with a really good policy setting. And I think one of the questioners before talked about EPBC specifying, standards or quality for environmental biodiverse plantings. We've got now large-scale works going on for carbon offsets through environmental plantings. We've got stewardship agreements in New South Wales and similar things in other states. These policy instruments are starting to sort of push a bit of demand, but it's a bit hit and miss. There's not really any coordination. We used to have, this used to be done by catchment management authorities in New South Wales, and they've gone by the wayside, and their catchment plans are now sort of motherhood statements, not necessarily specific. We want 100 hectares of grey box grassy woodland. We want 300 more hectares of weeping mild woodland. Until you've got those tangible targets set by either regulation or by some sort of funding injection, and it's consistent, and it's going to be there in 5 years and 10 years' time, you're only going to be getting the smaller scale players and the organisations that respond to grant funding, like LLS or Landcare or those sorts of things. What's really missing from this picture is industry. And in a forum like this one where we've got at this conference, just looking at that poll that was done this morning about who's there, there's a very strong weighting towards research, and there's some fantastic research going on, but it's the industry that's going to drive this to make it happen. And industry sort of looked on a little bit as a bit of a dirty word, but as Paul says, once you give an incentive to industry and you have some standards that are enforceable, industry is in a much better position to take this forward and do it on a very big scale and do it fairly quickly. All they need is that certainty of the market and probably a little injection of funding or grants or loans or whatever to get that capacity up to a slightly higher standard, and then it'll sort of roll on under its own steam.
Thanks, David. And thanks to all our panel members today. It's been great having this conversation. I wish I could keep it going, but I will be in trouble if I don't stop it. Just a couple of quick announcements. Anyone presenting in tomorrow morning's session, can you please make sure you bring your talk over to the conference solutions team so they could load it up to the system. We're supposed to be having more afternoon tea right now, and then after that Martin's going to give us a bit of a intro to the next item on the program, which will be heading over to the gardens for the next session. So,
if I may,
do you want to do it now?
Yes, I think we're a little over time. Yeah, so you're sacked.
Yep. I'll just relax for the rest of the conference.
If we can just grab your afternoon tea and have a toilet break if needed, I will wait outside and we'll depart from here at 4:30 if we can. And it'd be good if we can all travel together rather than higgledy-piggledy.
No worries. And just one last thank you to everyone up on the stage and online. Great presentations. Thanks for contributing.